It's time to take a step beyond. The podcast to inspire creativity and imagination. Here's your host, Dr. Anthony Poston.
Thanks for tuning in to A Step Beyond. I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and every Saturday morning I'd wake up, head to the living room, and watch cartoons. Mostly Warner Brothers cartoons featuring Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner, and my absolute favorite, Marvin the Martian. In fact, I have a room in my house with walls full of hand-painted cells of Marvin by the late Chuck Jones, who was one of Warner Brothers' greatest artists. However, today, cartoons, or animated films and shorts, are created very differently than they used to be 40 to 50 years ago. And our guest today is both a visual artist and leader in creating today's animated hits. She's currently a cinematographer and the director of photography for lighting at Pixar Studios. She's worked on many famous Pixar movies, some of which are Oscar winners, including A Bug's Life, Toy Story 2, Monsters, Inc., Finding Nemo, The Incredibles, Ratatouille, Wall-E, Brave, and Coco. Ladies and gentlemen, the very talented Danielle Feinberg. Danielle, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, it's my pleasure. So let's first talk about how you got started. You're originally from Boulder, Colorado. I have a brother that lives out in Colorado, out in that area.
Nice.
You went to Harvard, and I think you played softball there too, right?
Yep.
So so you're an athlete, and then you decided you were kind of an IT technical / engineering nerd, and then you shifted to computer science. So while in college, so talk about that whole process and how you got into animation.
Sure. Well, I got into computers. Dad at my elementary school offered a programming class, and the era is basically my memory is 3 of the first Apple computers. And so he taught a class after school, and I thought, well, I don't know what programming is, but I like these computer things, so I'll take that. And it was in a language called Logo, which happens to be you write code that drives an icon of a turtle around that leaves a line wherever it goes. So you're drawing pictures essentially with code. And so, I didn't know it at the time, but it seems particularly fortuitous now that was my introduction to programming, was making images. And it sort of went from there where I love programming, and it kind of turned into my hobby. And without really thinking about it, a lot of the programming I was doing was to make images. And when I got to college, I thought, well, maybe I'll do engineering. And I looked at the classes, and I was like, well, I'm not that into these classes, so I'll take these computer science classes that count for anything in engineering while I figure out what I'm going to do, because I already know I love computers. And about 2 weeks in, I went, oh, why am I not studying computer science then? So then I became a computer science major. And really the thing was, the one class that I was extra excited to take was the computer graphics class. And I was so into it that the year before, I emailed the professor and asked him if there was anything I could do for the class beforehand. And I got a very confused reply, because when you're at Harvard, usually students aren't emailing professors for extra work. But I took that computer graphics class, and the professor's teaching us about the programming behind it, but one day he played the old Pixar short films from the late 80s and early 90s. And I can still very clearly today sort of recall that feeling of just sitting there and my mind being blown, and sort of the idea that all the math, science, and code I've been learning could come together to create any world you wanted with characters and tell stories was just pure magic. And I thought, that's what I have to do with my life, and I don't know how I'm going to do it. I don't know that there's jobs out there for this, but that's what I have to do. And then the next year, my senior year in college, Toy Story came out, and so then there was clearly a company that had done these short films, that had done this one feature animated film, which is the first time there had been a feature-length computer animated film, and so I set my sights on Pixar.
Okay, so correct me, in computer science at Harvard versus engineering, did you have to take a bunch of calculus classes?
I did.
Yeah, so did I. I hate calc so bad. I took 4 semesters of calc in college. I couldn't differentiate an equation now if my life depended on it. Because if you don't use it, you lose it. So
that's right.
So explain animation in the early 90s. And did you take any art classes while in school? Because animation was very different than it is compared to today.
Yeah. I did take art classes. I took art classes all growing up. I come from an artistic family, and so the classes that my parents sort of threw us into when we were younger generally were art classes. So, for probably all my teenage years, every Wednesday we went to this woman who was an artist in Boulder, and the kids would all just come to her space, and you would think up an art project, and she had the supplies, and she would help you execute it. And so when I got to college, that was a natural part of things. It wasn't easy to fit in, but there was a year-long animation class that I was dying to take that had nothing to do with computers. It was traditional animation. And so I had to sort of finagle my way into that class. As a computer science major, you don't have a lot of clout in the art department, but I managed to get in, and for my final film that you made the second semester of that class, I used some computer animation with some other stuff overlaid on it, which was its whole own thing because they had no idea how to make that happen, and I was using some weird computer in the attic of some building with some software that nobody knew how to use, so it was quite an adventure.
Okay, so let's shift here just for a second. I know that you, like me, want to inspire people and would love to see more women enter STEM fields. STEM, for those who have never heard that word before, stands for science, technology, engineering, and math. What inspired you to get into engineering and computer science? Let's start with that.
I think my parents really, for my entire life, had always been about encouraging my sister and I that anything that we loved that's the things you should pursue. And when I was in school, I loved all kinds of things. I loved all the math and science classes I took. I loved writing. I loved reading. I loved lots of classes. I mostly just loved learning. And so when it came to it, it was well, if I can study computer science, I already love programming, so that's the way to go. And, I think one of the key things was I went to this private elementary school in Boulder, which is a fairly unusual school. It's called Bixby School, and the founders were these really unusual educators, and Bart was one of the founders, and he would handwrite our math assignments every day for all the kids that were, I guess probably, kindergarten through sixth grade. It ran through sixth grade. And so what it meant is I had this really tailored experience of he would write my math assignment based on where I was in math. And so the people that were doing well in math, he could really push. And then we had these really interesting sort of science classes where you were much more hands-on. You weren't sitting at desks with someone lecturing at you all the time. And I think what happened that in the programming class, I just fell in love with these things, and that school was small enough and interesting enough. No one was telling me that girls don't do that. The message that you get, whether people are intending to give it to you or not, they don't even realize they're doing it sometimes. That message did not exist there. It was a small enough school and an interesting enough place that by the time I got to public school, in middle school, and in high school, and people start kind of delivering that message, however unintentional, I didn't care. I already loved those things, and I didn't care if people didn't think I should be doing them. Because my parents had instilled this, follow the things you love, I wasn't about to give up on it.
Okay, so what do you think then, as a woman, we need to do as a culture to get more women into STEM fields?
I think there's a couple things that can have a really profound effect on sort of each individual, and I think that being able to show girls the things that they can do with STEM is really important, because STEM you can actually use to create things. And a lot of times STEM becomes about here's a problem set or here's your set of math problems, and you complete them, and if you did them correctly, you get a good grade. And that doesn't always appeal to girls, this sort of A to B to get this thing. It's well, if you knew that you could use that math and you could use this physics to make the hair on Merida in Brave move correctly when the wind blows, that's a really different thing to think about than I have to do this problem set and it has to get done and I have to do it the right way. And so I think having girls understand you can make movies, you can make art, you can make music, you can do fashion, you can do all kinds of things with STEM. That turns it into a different thing because it's a means to an end instead of the thing that you're just going to sit there all day doing math at a table. And so I think that's an important thing. It's also sometimes not as visible that it's actually really a social thing. There are very few fields of STEM where you are sitting all by yourself, not collaborating with others. And I think there's this sort of mythology about what a scientist is you sit in your lab in your lab coat and you don't talk to anyone. And that just fundamentally isn't true for the majority of jobs. And so that's another misconception. And I think the other thing is, if for fathers who have daughters, if they can spend some time telling their daughters, you can do anything you want to do. Don't let people tell you that's a boy thing, because there's so many people, the women I work with here at Pixar who are successful, or women I've met out in the world who are successful. So many times it goes back to their dad, certainly their parents, but their dad telling them, look, you can do anything you want to do, and really encouraging them to ignore that message that comes through sometimes of there's boy things and girl things. So those are some sort of attainable things that are easy to give to girls that can encourage them in STEM fields.
Let's talk a little bit specifically about what you do. I have a good friend, Greg Russell. He's a sound mixer there in L.A. I think he's been nominated for like 17 Oscars.
Wow.
In fact, if for my listeners, if you want to hear a great interview with Greg, go back to season 2. It's actually quite wonderful. But one thing I've learned with Greg is that people often take things for granted. In Greg's world, people take sound for granted. Mm-hmm. I've watched him mix movies at the studio over Columbia Pictures, and I can attest that without sound, a movie is totally lifeless. I mean, a movie. People think of a movie in terms of its visual, but without the sound, it is really lifeless. You work with lighting, albeit artificial light, because it's an animated kind of a world. Talk about how that brings an animated movie to life.
Sure. Well, I think sometimes it's hard for people to imagine what lighting means for us, and so I'll just start off by saying we create a three-dimensional world inside the computer, sort of like any video game you've seen where someone's running around a world. If you go around the corner of a building, the building is there. It's sort of this thing that exists in this virtual world. And if we didn't put any lights into that world, it would actually come out black, because the code that generates those images is looking around at the world and trying to mimic the physics of real life. So if there's no lights, it's going to come out black. And so for a scene, maybe you decide it's this very poignant moment, and so you're going to set it at sunset for the movie. We would go in and add a light that is the sun, and then and sort of see how that looks, and the light bounces off the sky, and you get that sort of bluish purple light coming down. It bounces off the ground. You get kind of warm light underneath things. And we look at that, and we decide how to sort of augment from there. And so we sort of start in this basis of what the computer's giving us of what it thinks is sort of the real world. And then we take our artistic license to make it beautiful, to make the emotion correct, to really sell the story. We want it to have depth. The computer makes things look very flat if you aren't careful. So we're setting a lot of the emotion just purely by time of day or weather. We also can make the characters, if you do a bad job lighting, they look terrible. If you do a good job, they can look wonderful. We had a problem with Wall-E early on where, he's a robot with these sort of binoculars, and he doesn't speak, and so there's a lot of importance put on the acting of those binoculars in his face because it's all that animators really had to convey what his emotion was. And when we got into lighting, the binoculars were super reflective and kind of he looked glassy-eyed, which is another way of saying he looked dead inside, which when you're trying to sell a robot has a soul inside, that's like the antithesis of what you want. And so that's a nice example that I give of where, like, if lighting doesn't do their job, you've ruined the whole movie because no one's really going to believe Wall-E has a soul because he's going glassy-eyed. So we figure out some lighting tricks to make it so he still looks like a robot. We don't put googly eyes on him or something, but you start to sort of reveal some of the inner workings of those binoculars, so you really feel like there's a character in there and there's some eyes. And so there's a huge range of what lighting does for the movie, and mostly I think it's invisible to the audience, but if we didn't put lighting in, it'd be black, and if we did this sort of rudimentary lighting, it would not sell the emotion of the story in the same way that it does now.
In another interview, you once said that you try to create a feel in an animated movie. So you mentioned emotion, but this feel that you're trying to create, you also said that you don't want it to be too realistic. What does that mean?
Well, we're not in the business of, say, physics simulations for a law case or something like that. We are trying to tell stories. And so what we're trying to do, we're not trying to make something look exactly like real life, because otherwise for some of these movies you could just go film a live-action film, right? The beauty of computer animation, the thing that drew a lot of us to this, is that you can create any world that you want. So if you want to make a movie like Monsters Incorporated, you can make the Monsters world. If you want to make Coco, you can make the Land of the Dead, and it's up to your imagination to figure out sort of what that should be. The problem is in the computer, because you can do anything, you can actually make things, if you get too far off of reality, in terms of if the light doesn't move around correctly or the physics of, say, like, I don't know, something exploding isn't right, it can look kind of dumb. Or if you do humans and they look too real, that can look, they call it the uncanny valley, and it's like off-putting to the audience. And so what we're always striving for is believable. We're trying to create a believable world, not a photorealistic recreation of the real world. We're trying to create something believable, because that also leaves us room to do some stylization. Like if you picture The Incredibles or The Incredibles 2, it's set in this era of the 50s and 60s, that really cool mid-century modern kind of feel to it. And we want to do that, and the characters are real stylized, and that's super fun. And so we're not really going for realistic, we're just going for believable.
Yeah, you also said that rather than trying to mimic reality, you exaggerate some stuff and suppress other things. Talk about that a bit.
Well, it's if you think about a movie like Finding Nemo, where we're trying to make a movie underwater, and at that point, we had never done a movie underwater, and for that matter, neither had anyone else in computer animation. So you have to go figure out how to make things look underwater. So the first thing that our sort of R&D and looks team did was they got some footage of underwater for, I think it was like maybe 2 or 3 different shots, recreated them in the computer and got them as close to it as they could. Then thought about, okay, how did we get there? Well, they decided in the end there's 5 or 6 elements that are critical to making things look underwater. Then you go develop the technology so that instead of this thing where you spent, 4 months or something creating these shots with this, you're throwing together technology to make it look right, you take that and you kind of package it up so anyone from the new person who walks in the door to the person who's been there a long time can use that technology for those 5 or 6 elements across the, sometimes these movies have 2,000 shots, sometimes it's more like 1,500. And so you can make underwater across an entire movie in a way that the artist can tune it to make it look the way the director wants and the director of photography wants. And so that's kind of the process of how we go about it.
So, unlike the old days of animation, where they would actually kind of lay out a script and then they would storyboard, which I know you still storyboard. You storyboard the story out in the sequence of events that that kind of take place in that story, and then they would hand paint and hand draw every still shot. Mm-hmm. And then photograph that, and then basically run a series of photographs and create motion. Kind of like those old books as a kid, where you had a corner image and you'd flip the pages and you'd see the character running or something. Mm-hmm. Very similar to that. What you do today is very different because it is all computer based. So what you do requires a good understanding of science, math, and physics. Why is that?
Well, on some level, it's the same thing in terms of we're still generating an image that are a series of images that are all played together. So film runs at 24 frames a second. So everything in the movies is based around 24 frames a second. And so for a second of any movie we're seeing, we've generated 24 images. And so it's all about getting those sort of images on the screen. So there's a huge range of people here at Pixar. There's people who know nothing about math and physics, and it never comes into their daily life. There are people that understand it on some level and apply it maybe. They understand how things move in the world. Like, take our animators. They understand how things move in the world. They have made their life a study of how things move and how to show emotion through movement and sort of dialogue, certainly, but most of the root of it is coming through the movement of the character. But they're not going to sit down and solve a physics problem. We have people in our software engineering group who maybe work on the hair simulator, and they understand physics to more than a PhD level. And so we actually have a broad range of people that are sort of understanding those things at all different levels. The core of what we do is we're using software that's using math and science and code to get to where we're going. And so there's people trying to use that at all levels. And so, it's never the process of drawing and then painting it in. It's a much more sort of, maybe those are two talents or a couple of talents. And here we have people across the entire spectrum of the pipeline making the movie that have all different talents. And even within one department, some people are super techie and know a lot of STEM, and some people are artistic and know kind of how to make the computer do what they want. So it's sort of interesting because it's a different process, but there's a lot of things that are same, and there's definitely a lot more STEM involved, although the kind of cool thing is that there's a range of jobs available kind of thing, and so you get this really cool mix of sort of pure creatives to pure technical people and everything in between, which sort of yields its own results in the movie, I think.
You spent over 21 years at Pixar, right?
Yeah, I'm about to hit my 22-year anniversary.
Okay, so I asked that question because I know that part of that was back when Steve Jobs ran the company, and then Disney bought it years later. So part of your life there was under Steve, part of your life there has been under Disney. Were there any big changes that occurred during that transition?
One of the cool things when Disney bought us, because we were all pretty freaked out when Disney bought us, that everything was going to change. But one of the cool things is I think Steve set it up very carefully so that Pixar could continue being Pixar, but we could have the sort of safety of Disney so that we could continue to make sort of risky, unusual movies, like A Robot Who Doesn't Speak, or Rats Who Cook, or these things where, or like a movie like Inside Out. Those are really unusual movies that, if you pitch that to someone, they're not going to be like, oh, yeah, clearly that's going to be a blockbuster, And that's sort of what's at the heart of Pixar. A lot of the people work here because we do work on unusual movies. And I think Steve knew with Bob Iger, who was the head of Disney at that point, that Bob Iger understood it, and they put some pieces in place to make sure that Pixar stayed Pixar. And really the only thing that changed fundamentally was the people who are running Pixar now were spending half their time helping Disney Animation kind of get back to a really happy place. The directors and the people working there felt like they had control over their movies and got to do great stuff. And so we were missing our people a little more than normal. But otherwise, it actually was kind of the best you could hope for when you're being bought by someone, because they clearly sort of valued us, and Steve knew what he was doing and sort of was protecting us from what sometimes happens when companies buy another company. So I think we missed having Steve around as much because he was so brilliant, but he was still totally involved.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but when Pixar came into the Disney fold, wasn't Disney still making animated movies the old-fashioned way?
No, they were making computer animated films. Right around that time, right after, they released Princess and the Frog, which was a 2D hand-drawn. And I think a lot of people here really felt like 2D hand-drawn movies should still live on, that it wasn't that 3D computer animation was an evolution of 2D hand-drawn. It was just a different art form. But unfortunately, I think a lot of people saw how much a movie like Toy Story made, and they decided that this was the next evolution, and they sort of started abandoning 2D hand-drawn.
Well, it's far more labor-intensive, no question there. As far as
I don't know that is actually true.
Well, I mean,
our movies take on average 4 years to make, so
what I'm saying
different
is
labor, I guess.
Yeah, what I'm saying is, I've actually sat and watched a Disney animator, doing their thing. Mm-hmm. It's just such a laborious process, I mean, because you talk about making 24 pictures or 24 images per second. Well, when you're hand drawing these things, then they have people who outline them, and then people who paint them, and then it's just one after the other, and it's just a very human intensive process. Whereas your tools are your skill, and you can't cheat at all. I mean, you either have the skill or you don't.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people who, in the olden days, would have been terrible designers or terrible artists because they didn't have the human skill, so to speak, to do that by hand. But when it comes to computers, they're great artists and designers because the computer helps them with that. They don't have to worry about having that human ability as much to draw, so to speak. So speaking of technology, then let's just jump into this. Technology, I think you would agree, has definitely changed our lives in many, many, many ways. So when you make an animated movie today, is it easier or more difficult because of technology? I ask this question because I know that with technology, sometimes people use technology because it's so powerful and can do so many things. People start doing things because they can, but they don't. But they don't often ask if we should be doing this.
Sure.
They start dumping stuff in. It's kind of like taking a photograph and over photoshopping it, and because you can, Talk about that a little bit.
Sure. One of the cool things here is that all of our movies, the ideas for them come from the director. So the director goes off, they think up 3 ideas, they kind of pitch them to some of the other creative heads here. The creative heads sort of poke at each one and sort of go, oh, well, that one sounds like the best idea. And then the director goes off and they work on it some more. And there's this whole process of sort of the birth of the movie, let's say. And you get a story team and they start drawing storyboards. And the cool thing is that they are not paying any attention to what technology allows them to do or doesn't allow them to do. So when the director of Finding Nemo, Andrew Stanton, comes up with, I want to make a movie about fish underwater, we don't know how to do that technically. But that doesn't stop us. It's sort of like, well, we're going to make this story, and so let's figure it out. And so especially in the earlier years here where no one had encountered these barriers in computer animation because there just wasn't a lot of computer animation out there. It was like, well, we don't know how to do hair for Monsters Incorporated, so let's go do the R&D and figure it out. And we don't know how to do long hair or curly hair, and we don't know how to do underwater, and we don't know how to do crowds. And so a lot of the technological advances were driven by story, and so there was a need for them and a reason we were doing them because the story dictated it, not because someone thought it would be cool to do it and just doing it for the sake of doing it. But the other thing that happens is as computers get faster and our technology gets better and our tools get better, the sort of creative vision of the directors gets bigger and bigger. And so it doesn't actually seem to get any faster for us to make the movies. It just seems we keep being able to advance what we can put on the screen. Now, that said, I don't know, someone told me that you could render the original Toy Story in a couple hours or something now. So it's clearly things are much faster, but we just keep getting them sort of more advanced and more things on the screen and more complicated stuff happening. And so you always sort of eat your gains like that just because you want to, everybody here gets really excited about putting the best thing possible on screen.
And the reason I asked that question is I remember, when Photoshop came out and people started having access to Photoshop, and next thing you know, you start seeing the latest, coolest filter showing up in everybody's thing. It's totally. Kind of like they just jumped on that because they could. All right, so the purpose of this podcast is to inspire people. Obviously, I'm all about inspiring people of all types and ages because that's my passion in life. Computer science tends to be a pretty male-dominated field. We talked about that earlier, and I know you're involved in Girls Who Code and a variety of other things to help inspire girls into STEM fields. If you are speaking to a large audience of young people, college students, whatever, what would you say to help inspire them to do something greater?
In general, in the world, you mean, or in computer science?
Just whatever. I mean, to inspire somebody to want to go beyond where they would have had they not been inspired. Yeah.
Well, I think for me, the real key has always been to find the things that I'm passionate about and that inspire me. And so I didn't sit down early on and say what I want to do is computer science. I sort of said, I'm just going to do the things I find interesting, and I'm going to try and leave room in my life so that I can take the weird class about the weird thing if I want to. And so instead of closing things down, like I am 13 and I am going to be a lawyer, right? It's sort of like it was, well, maybe I'll be this or maybe I'll be that, and I'm going to take this class and I'm going to go to this thing and sort of experience a lot of stuff. And I found the things that I am super passionate about. I still am out there finding more things I'm passionate about, of course. But, I come to work and I get to work on movies and I get to use computer science and I get to use art. And that makes it so that my day at work does not feel like work. It's like I love what I do. And what that also means is that I work really hard at it and I care deeply about it, and that shows in my work. And so what has happened then is that I have gotten rewarded for that and sort of moved up the ladder. And, I think, to me, the worst thing in life is if you don't find the things that you love, be it, hopefully it's at work, but outside of work too, because the amount of inspiration you get out of it and joy in life is sort of unparalleled. And so, and I think especially for the women or minorities out there, finding the things you love so that you have the toughness to stick through it when people are trying to tell you that you can't do it or they're sort of standing in your way. Like, I sort of was like, I don't care what you have to say, and I don't care what roadblocks you're putting up because I care about this and I'm just going to do it. I don't care. So it sort of transfers into hard work not feeling like hard work, which is going to get you, hard work gets you farther than anything in this world, I think, more than smarts. And it also it gets you joy in life, and it sort of just all comes together to create a lot of wonderful things and gives you the sort of chutzpah to get through the hard times.
I got to tell you, I'm inspired oftentimes out of inquiry and wanting to solve a problem. For example, over the holidays, I've known for a long time my website was somewhat dated, but I was just either I'm not sure if it was because I was too cheap or because I just didn't want to have to deal with somebody else to constantly give them updates and have them fix my site for me and stuff. Mm-hmm. So I committed a week and a half over the holidays to update my HTML coding skills. And,
nice.
There was a day I was really good at it, but that was a long time ago and things have changed a lot, right? So yeah. I spent a week and a half relearning HTML5, CSS, all the current JavaScript stuff. And, to the dismay of my wife, I actually got pretty decent at it, and but that's why, because I was inspired to solve a problem, and that's just kind of ingrained into me. I mean, I find something I want to do, and I just figured out how to do it. And if I have to waste, people would say, "Well, you're wasting a lot of time. You could have just hired somebody to do that." Well, I could have, but I wanted to know how to do it. That way, I could fix the problem faster if I had to. So, yeah, everybody's different. I get that, And when I look at what you do every day, it does look super fun. I mean, you work in a field that just oozes creativity, no question about it.
Yeah.
But I also know there's always a dark side, a not so fun aspect to every job out there. What's yours?
Well, the release dates for these movies, once they're set, you can't move them. And so there's this very, very unrelenting deadline. And sort of the additional pressure on top of that is that, unlike an app where you can just keep releasing versions of it and improving, our movies, when we release them, that's it. That's how they're going to live on for the rest of eternity, for however long, these movies live. So there's a huge amount of pressure about kind of that deadline and the product that you're putting out at that deadline. And, part of me super thrives on that because I love the pressure of, look, you only have 4 months left to go. We have all these shots left to get done. How are we going to pull this off? And, my brain loves the problem solving of that, of how we can sort of make an impossible task happen. But it certainly is stressful. And so I think it's probably the stress of that that's the hardest thing for me and sometimes the people around me probably is when I'm at the end of these movies. It's pretty intense. So
yeah, you see, you and I are very much the same on that regard. So, okay, I've written many times in books and things I've written that practice makes permanent, not perfect. That that you should always be striving towards perfection by making daily incremental improvements in what we do. It's never going to be perfect.
Right.
We just strive for it. You've been doing this for a very long time, over 2 decades. How do you push yourself, and what do you do to become better at it? I mean, because sometimes you get bogged down in the doing of it all the time. How do you what do you do to become better?
Well, I totally agree with you. The more you do something, the better you get at it. And certainly making great images, I will never, ever tire of that. Every shot in a movie, every movie is different. Every scene in a movie is different. And so that is never tiresome to me at all. And you learn something from every single time you go and do it. I'm learning something new. And so that becomes really an important part of it, I think. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's that's the greatest part of it. I think outside of that, I'm looking for inspiration different places. So, maybe I go to a museum and you see something and you think, oh, look at how these. I was recently in Italy and went to this museum and saw how these painters from long ago are doing this special thing, and I thought, oh, I wonder if we could do that in computer graphics. Like, that would be really cool, Or I see some photo for something. I saw some photos from Iceland the other day, which is a really amazing place, and this person was a beautiful photographer. I went and looked at all their photos from their trip to Iceland and thought, oh, that's really inspirational. And so besides the doing of it, I'm always going out and looking for different inspiration. That comes on a programming STEM level, too, where I see an article about something and you kind of go down the rabbit hole of, well, how'd they do that and what's that all about? And so I think it's, for me at least, that sort of dual thing of the doing and then the inspiration of what other people are doing that inspires you to think about things a different way and get the creative juices kind of flowing.
Yes, yeah, and that was going to be my next question for you is how do you stay creative and how do you feed your imagination, which, we all have different ways of doing that. But, aside from being a creative in a creative field, you were also a college athlete. And so here's my little tiny rant on this, and I want your take on this. I like most people, I'm a sports fan, but I'm not a fanatic, and one of the things that really gets on my nerves today is the obsession with sports, especially by parents who all seem to think their son or daughter will one day play professionally, which we all know is probably likely not going to happen. And I'm overgeneralizing, I know, but I've seen enough parents do this to know they tend to live vicariously through their kids. They tote them from town to town, whether it's through school or AAU or whatever, which ultimately for a lot of these kids today leaves very little time for them to be creative or follow their other interests or endeavors. Since you were both an athlete and a STEM nerd both, which is kind of a rarity, there aren't too many of you in the world. It's usually one or the other. What do you think the long-term solution is to this problem, or maybe you don't think it's a problem?
Well, I think there's a general problem these days from what I know of my sort of contact with students today and sort of friends who have students today, because I don't have kids, but that there's a lot of pressure being put on kids, sometimes not from the parents, sometimes from the parents, but also sometimes not from the parents. Like, I have a couple friends that are like, I don't know where this is coming from in my kid. They think they have to be perfect kind of thing. And so I think there's, in general, way too much pressure on kids, not enough freedom to sort of, experience a lot of things, which is the beauty of being a kid, I think, is experiencing lots of things and figuring out what are the things that you really love. You watch these athletes who their parents push, and then they sort of explode at a certain point, and it's like, I don't think there's anything worse for me personally than seeing someone who's living someone else's dream, because it just never makes for a happy person. So I think generally that's a problem, absolutely. I have no idea how to solve it or where these things are coming from. I don't know how much of it is sort of social media and stuff, but for me, the sports part of it was this really critical piece in terms of, I learned all about how to operate within a team and what teamwork really truly meant. There's sort of sportsmanship also, which I actually take very seriously and sort of applies in life. But also that when I was in college, that was sort of my family. Those were the people that we kind of looked out for each other. And when I went to, say, my computer science class, and I was one of only a couple of girls in there, and it was not a very friendly environment, I didn't have to take that to heart and take it so seriously, because I knew as soon as I walked out of there, I had all my friends on the softball team. I had a whole other thing going on. And so sports actually allowed me to survive that, I think, the difficulties of that. That was another important element. And it also gave me, when I switched from my little private elementary school into middle school, and I knew like 2 people in a school of hundreds, that was a really daunting thing. But I was good at sports, and as soon as I get on the first sports team, I suddenly have friends on that team. And so it gave me this softer ramp into that because of the social aspect that goes along with it. And so I think, as always, there's the good and the bad side to things. And I don't know, hopefully it can go back to just being sort of a positive thing without as much pressure on kids overall. Because I also have to say that the generation that are students now, I find to just be awe-inspiring. They care about the things that really matter and not the goofy stuff that the older generations we all seem to care about. They care about the environment. They care about, really concrete things, and I think they're undaunted by things that some of us really were daunted by when we were kids. And so I think there's actually a huge, huge amount of potential coming from that generation.
And I couldn't agree more. There are lots and lots of positive things that come out of sports. And you mentioned the teamwork and the work ethic, and I agree. They're wonderful things. But there's something to the fact that if you look at the international scores of science and and math and all these things, there's a reason why I think China and India are surpassing the United States. And one of the reasons, if you're looking at comparisons, they don't have anywhere near the obsession with sports that we have.
Yeah.
And there's something to that, I think. I don't know what it is, but hey, Danielle, thank you so much. I know you're super busy, and I really appreciate your willingness to speak with me today. Let me ask the show by asking you this. What would you say to someone who would like to do what you were doing now?
Yeah. Take all your STEM classes and see if you love them, and take some art classes too. And if you love making movies, make movies, even if it's a 30-second movie on your iPhone, or make a flip book on your phone, or even with your notebook or something. And if you like doing computer animation or programming, just mess around with it, play around. There's so much stuff online where you can learn for free now, where when I was growing up, that stuff wasn't around. And so there's so many opportunities, and really the way to get good is really truly just by doing it and finding kind of your own voice and your own style.
Well, thank you again, Danielle. You should be extremely proud of what you have accomplished, because you've done a lot in your career, and I'm sure there are many, many more great things yet to come. And when you've done them, we'll have you back on the show to talk about them.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
And thank all of you for listening and taking a step beyond with us. I've said this many times. If you love what you do for a living, you will never work a day in your life. And this principle definitely defines Danielle. We should all be striving to do what we love to do every day, so we can exhibit the high level of passion and energy necessary to work hard and be awesome at it. And in Danielle's case, her awesomeness will definitely serve to help other women get excited about and excel in STEM careers too, because it will eventually rub off on other people. I hope you'll continue to listen to A Step Beyond and become inspired to be the very best version of yourself. I'm your host, Anthony Postian. Follow your dreams.
Thanks for listening to A Step Beyond. Take a moment, if you would, and leave a review on iTunes and share the podcast with those who need to be inspired to become more creative and imaginative in everything they do.